Greetings, Remnant Church and online friends. Welcome to the Midweek Refuel, where we seek out the ancient wisdom, simply because modern wisdom has grown very, very old, very, very weary, and very, very suspicious of joy. I first read Chesterton's Orthodoxy in 1994, shortly after my salvation. I was raised in an educated Christian home where both parents were far more likely to be reading nonfiction, history, or theology, or even philosophy than you were likely to catch them watching television or reading something pulpy. By that point in my life, I had already read most of C.S. Lewis, and not because I fully understood Lewis, but because I had been raised on Lewis. He felt like a member of the household, and I found him comforting even when I wasn't quite sure what he was even talking about. Lewis taught me truth, but he taught me truth through the vessel of myth. He taught me the very difference between myth and true myth. But it wasn't until Chesterton, on the heels of my spiritual rebirth, that I learned to see the true myth in actuality, not merely as something symbolic or poetic, but as something that was quite literally woven into the very fabric of reality as we experience it. Chesterton strikes me as the jester-missionary-ambassador from fairyland, and he's inviting us all to abandon the gray seriousness of modern explanations and to instead recover the dangerous joy of a world that did not have to exist at all. He doesn't whisper enchantment at us. He laughs it into existence. He doesn't smuggle past our defenses. He instead charges the gate, ringing the bells, daring us to admit that the world is stranger, happier, and more demanding than our explanations allow. Right, Butter? Do you want in on this? Yes? Okay. Well, I'm sure more people will watch with you on. Chesterton writes these most delicious words. He writes, quote, "I left the fairy tales lying on the floor of the nursery, and I have not found any books so sensible since," unquote. I'll read that again. Chesterton writes these most delicious lines. "I left the fairy tales lying on the floor of the nursery, and I have not found any books so sensible since. I myself have searched a lifetime to find works, novels, anything as true and as honest as Narnia, as true and as honest as Middle-earth, as true and as honest as the lands of George MacDonald. I have read the great philosophers and the great works of fiction, and none of them come close to achieving the simple and powerful beauty of a world that is meaningful before it is explained to me, moral before it is systematized, and joyful before it's ever justified. The very way that publishers now manipulate the classics makes me a little uneasy and a little angry. The way they do it is itself a sign of the modern sickness. The current publishing order for the Chronicles of Narnia, just as an example, disrupts the natural discovery of wonder, replacing the enchantment of the novels with explanation and replacing mystery with management. And this is not only about ordering. Even Chesterton himself had been edited, rearranged, and sometimes softened in later hands. I do not believe this is usually done out of malice. I have to believe that it's not done out of malice, I have to believe it is done because many modern editors are completely and totally blind to the worldview. They're blind to what Chesterton would have called the shadow of holiness, and the shadow of holiness that rests upon these and certain stories. They see literature where the author intended liturgy. They see imagination where there's actually reverence being served, and they see cleverness where there is worship happening. Lewis, Chesterton, MacDonald, Tolkien, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, are not merely telling stories or making arguments. They are bearing witness to reality. And when you are blind to the radiant holiness of a thing, your instinct is always the same, to rearrange it, to clarify it, to make it safer, because holiness is dangerous. Until, at last, you have explained the life right out of it. That impulse to reorder, to optimize, to correct, before one has even learned to marvel, is exactly what Chesterton is resisting. Fairy tales do not begin with footnotes. They begin with wardrobe doors, or doors in general. And once you force the map into the child's hands before he's ever walked the road, you've not made him wiser. You've made him tired. Some of us remember when the world still felt like a wardrobe. Ordinary on the outside, dangerous and beautiful on the inside. We didn't need it explained to us. We only needed the courage to step through. This entire section lays out almost prophetically the exact reasons our younger generations today are anxious, depressed, and emotionally exhausted, and clinically so. We have trained them, you and I have trained them to analyze before they are ever allowed to wonder at a thing, to explain it before they are permitted to delight in it, and to manage meaning instead of receiving meaning. We have handed them systems before stories. We have handed them outcomes before obedience. And we have given them explanations before they have experienced joy. And when you remove wonder from the world around you, you do not get a land of maturity. You get a land of despair. Because a world that must be justified before it can be enjoyed is a world too heavy for a child to carry. Chesterton understood this long before the therapists, long before the algorithms, long before the publishers did. He saw that when enchantment is stripped away, the soul does not become sober, the soul becomes starved. So what has been stolen from you? I hope you're asking yourself that question. What has been stolen from you? Not comfort, not convenience, definitely not distraction. So what's been stolen? Perhaps meaning, joy, simple moral gravity, the sense that the world is a gift before it becomes your problem. Chesterton saw what was coming at us. I really believe he saw it clearly, but I believe that even Chesterton, the Prince of Paradox, who wrote with such laughter and joy and thunder, I believe that even now he would weep uncontrollably if he could see what full-blown disenchantment has done to the world. Children raised on explanations instead of wonder, adults exhausted by freedoms they were never meant to manage, and souls trained to suspect joy as though it were a lie. This is why the Ethics of Elfland matters. It is not nostalgia. It is rescue, and much needed. It is Chesterton ringing a bell from fairyland, reminding us that reality itself is still enchanted, and that obedience, gratitude, joy only makes sense once you admit that the world did not have to exist at all. And hear this clearly. What happened to you was not by accident. It was also not a personal failure at its root. You were not broken. You were broken in sin, but in the way I'm talking, you were not broken. You were trained. You were trained to explain before you were allowed to live or to wonder. Trained to analyze your feelings, therapize them before you were permitted to feel them, trust them, learn to communicate with them. Trained to manage meaning instead of to receive glorious meaning. Many of us were taught the mechanics, the chemistry of love before we were ever allowed to love. We were handed chemical explanations for joy. Here's how it happens. Attachment. Here's how it does it. And affection before we were taught what those things were for. Not because knowledge is evil, it's not, but because knowledge given in the wrong order becomes corrosive like acid. Explanation was allowed to arrive before the experience, and reduction was allowed to arrive before reverence. And when you do that to a person, when you do that, especially to a child, you don't make them wise. You make them self-conscious. You make them guarded. You make them very tired and exhausted. You teach them to suspect their own delight. You explain the spell before they are permitted to feel its power or wonder at its wildness. This is why anxiety and exhaustion are everywhere today, clinically so. This is why so many people feel emotionally overburdened and spiritually stretched thin. A world that must be justified before it can be enjoyed is a world too heavy for the human soul to carry, especially for our young. Chesterton's purpose here is not to make us angry, but to shake us awake, to remind us that we are not meant to live in a world that feels like a machine that we must constantly interpret and manage. We are meant to live in a world received as a gift, a world where limits are mercies, where repetition is delight, and where obedience is not humiliation, but rather it is harmony. So if you feel weary, if joy feels suspicious to you, if gratitude feels naive, then understand this: you were trained out of enchantment. But blessed be his name, you can be trained back into it. And the Ethics of Elfland is not calling you backward into childhood fantasy. It is calling you forward into adult reality, rightly seen again. Now, before we turn to the text itself, I want to invite you to listen to it slowly as I read. What you're about to hear is one of my favorite sections in the book, one of my favorite sections in any book. And what you're about to hear is not commentary, it's not summary, it's not interpretation. It is Chesterton's very own words. So let them stand. Let them work in you their intended purpose. Let them do what living words have always done when they are allowed to breathe. If this series has been helpful to you, if it has clarified something, steadied something, or reawakened something, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with someone that you care about. Not for vanity, but because truth has a strange habit of getting caught in the barbed wire fence of the algorithm, unless real people like you and me help carry it through. So thank you. All right, let's step back into fairyland and hear Chesterton for himself. Well, I left the fairy tales lying on the floor of the nursery, and I have not found any book so sensible since. I left the nurse guardian of tradition and democracy, and I have not found any modern type so sanely radical or so sanely conservative. But the matter for important comment was here, that when I first went out into the mental atmosphere of the modern world, I found that the modern world was positively opposed on 2 points to my nursery and to the nursery tales. It has taken me a long time to find out that the modern world is wrong and my nurse was right. The really curious thing was this, that modern thought contradicted this basic creed of my boyhood on its two most essential doctrines. I have explained that the fairy tales founded in me two convictions. First, that this world is a wild and startling place, which might have been quite different, but which is quite delightful. Second, that before this wildness and delight, one may well be modest and submit to the queerest limitations of so queer a kindness. But I found the whole modern world running like a high tide against both my tendernesses. And the shock of that collision created two sudden and spontaneous sentiments which I have had ever since, and which, crude as they were, have since hardened into convictions. First, I found the whole modern world talking scientific fatalism, saying that everything is as it must always have been, being unfolded without thought from the beginning. The leaf on the tree is green because it could never have been anything else. Now, the fairy tale philosopher is glad that the leaf is green, precisely because it might have been scarlet. He feels as if it had turned green an instant before he looked at it. He is pleased that snow is white on the strictly reasonable ground that it might have been black. Every color has in it a bold quality of a choice. The red of garden roses is not only decisive, but dramatic, like suddenly spilt blood. He feels that something has been done. But the greatest determinists of the 19th century were strongly against this native feeling that something had happened an instant before. In fact, according to them, nothing ever really had happened since the beginning of the world. Nothing ever had happened since existence had happened, and even about the date of that, they were not very sure. The modern world, as I found it, was solid for modern Calvinism, for the necessity of things being as they are. But when I came to ask them, I found they had really no proof of this unavoidable repetition in things except the fact that things were repeated. Now, the mere repetition made the things to me rather more weird than more rational. It was as if, having seen a curiously shaped nose in the street and dismissed it as an accident, I had then seen 6 other noses of the same astonishing shape. I should have fancied for a moment that it must be some local secret society. So one elephant having a trunk was odd, but all elephants having trunks look like a plot. I speak here only of an emotion, and of an emotion at once stubborn and subtle. But the repetition in nature seems sometimes to be an excited repetition, like that of an angry schoolmaster saying the same thing over and over again. The grass seemed signaling to me with all its fingers at once. The crowded stars seemed bent upon being understood. The sun would make me see him if he rose 1,000 times. The reoccurrences of the universe rose to the maddening rhythm of an incantation. And I began to see an idea. All the towering materialism which dominates the modern mind rests ultimately upon one assumption, a false assumption. It is supposed that if a thing goes on repeating itself, it's probably dead, a piece of clockwork. People feel that if the universe was personal, it would vary. If the sun were alive, it would dance. This is a fallacy even in relation to known facts. For the variation in human affairs is generally brought into them not by life, but by death, by the dying down or breaking off of their strength or desire. A man varies his movements because of some slight element of failure or fatigue. He gets into an omnibus because he's tired of walking, or he walks because he's tired of sitting still. But if his life and joy were so gigantic that he never tired of going to Islington, he might go to Islington as regularly as the Thames goes to Sheerness. The very speed and ecstasy of his life would have the stillness of death. The sun rises every morning. I do not rise every morning, but the variation is due not to my activity, but to my inaction. Now, to put the matter in a popular phrase, it might be true that the sun rises regularly because he never gets tired of rising. His routine might be due not to a lifelessness, but rather to a rush of life. The thing I mean can be seen, for instance, in children, when they find some game or joke that they specially enjoy. A child kicks his legs rhythmically through excess, not absence of life. Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, do it again, and the grown-up person does it again until he's nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, do it again to the sun, and every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never gotten tired of making them. It may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. The repetition in nature may not be a mere reoccurrence. It may be a theatrical encore. Heaven may encore the bird who laid an egg. If the human being conceives and brings forth a human child instead of bringing forth a fish or a bat or a griffin, the reason may not be that we are fixed in an animal fate without life or purpose. It may be that our little tragedy has touched the gods, that they admire it from their starry galleries, and that at the end of every human drama, man is called again and again before the curtain. Repetition may go on for millions of years by mere choice, and at any instant, it may stop. Man may stand on the earth generation after generation, and yet each birth be his positively last appearance. If this has stirred something painful as well as hopeful in you tonight, that's okay. Healing often begins with remembering. One of the quiet tragedies of our time is the Chronicles of Narnia are now often published and presented wrong, incorrectly. They are reordered so that the explanation comes first. The creation story placed at the beginning, before the wardrobe, before wonder, before discovering that another world exists at all. But that is not how the story was meant to be received. You were meant to enter Narnia before you were ever told how it was made. Meaning was supposed to precede mastery. Wonder was supposed to come before explanation. What Chesterton helps us recover here is not ignorance, but order. Not less thinking, but rightly timed thinking. Wonder comes first. Obedience comes before clarity. Gratitude precedes control. When we reverse that order, when we give the graduation party 12 years before they graduate, when we insist on understanding everything before we trust anything, we don't become mature. We become paralyzed. And this isn't abstract. This is not some out there thought. We've seen this instinct at work in our own reorderings. We were handed explanations before we were given experiences. We were told mechanisms before we were shown meaning, analysis before trust. We were taught how things work before we were allowed to love them. And so life began to feel heavy, abstract, and exhausting. Correct? Perhaps. But devoid of joy, joyless. This is the world that Chesterton was resisting long before it fully and actually arrived. He understood that fairy tales, the stories that we tell each other to tell the truth, and reality itself must be entered into before they are explained. That obedience comes before clarity. That discipline comes before discipleship, that gratitude must come before control, and that when you reverse that, when you put the wrong things first, when you reverse the order, you're not protecting the soul that you're doing it for. You're wearying the soul. Here's the quiet resistance in all of this. Choosing to live in the right order in a world that insists on the wrong one. refusing to flatten your life into a diagram, refusing to demand reasons before trusting, refusing to treat joy as something that must justify itself before it's allowed to exist. Chesterton is not calling us backward into fantasy. He is calling us forward into reality, rightly seen again, a world received as gift, lived with reverence and awe, and inhabited with joy. And when you put the story back in the right order, whether it's Narnia or your life, the joy returns not as sentiment, but as strength. And when the world is put back in the right order, it doesn't just make sense again, it points somewhere. Begin with wonder, not ideas, not explanations, just wonder. The sound of footsteps on a quiet floor, cold air on your face when you weren't expecting it, light coming through a doorway you didn't know was there, a tree that did not have to grow, a sun that did not have to rise, a laugh that surprised you because it came from deeper than you planned. Receive the world again as gift before you ask what it's for. Then, only then, allow explanation to follow, not as a master, as a servant. Meaning unfolds slowly, truth deepens instead of flattens, reason takes its proper place, not standing over reality with crossed arms, but kneeling beneath it, holding it up like Atlas. And when the world is received in this way, when wonder comes first, when gratitude precedes control, when obedience makes sense because joy has finally and already arrived, there's only one place the heart can finally stand, not in control, not in cynicism, not in exhaustion, but rather in allegiance. Because if the world is gift, then there is a giver. If the story has meaning, then there is an author. And if joy makes sense at all, then the throne is not empty. We do not end with analysis. We end with worship. Christ is King. Hail to the King.